Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Ephesians. Today we're at Ephesians chapter 6, beginning to read at verse 21. We're now in Paul's concluding words of his letter to the Ephesian believers. Paul has wrapped up the content, the substance of his letter. Now he just has a few last words to say in closing. Notice verse 21. He says, Tychichus, the dear brother and faithful servant in the Lord, he will tell you everything, so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage you. Now, who is this Tychichus mentioned by the Apostle Paul? Obviously, he is a fellow believer in the Lord, a helper to Paul, an assistant to Paul in his ministry, and he is the one who is carrying the letter. Remember, Paul is a prisoner this time. He is in prison in Rome awaiting trial. And so he sends this letter to the Ephesians, and Tychichus is the carrier, the bearer of the letter. Now remember, of course, in this time in history, there's no such thing as a postal system. There's no postal service. The only postal service that existed in the Roman Empire was that which served the needs of the emperor and the government in Rome. And that service was only for the emperor's household and government officials. So anyone that sent a private letter, you had to find someone to take the letter for you. So obviously Tychichus had been with Paul in Rome, helping him in his imprisonment. Now you remember at the end of the book of Acts, we're told that Paul's imprisonment is house imprisonment. He's under house arrest, but he's allowed to have friends come and visit him and to minister to his needs. Tychichus is one of those. And so he is sending Tychichus with this letter to take it to the Ephesian believers. Now, Tychichus is mentioned just a few times in the New Testament, obviously here, but we meet him earlier in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 20, his name is mentioned as an associate of Paul. And what we learn from that episode, in Acts chapter 20 is toward the end of Paul's last missionary journey, his third missionary journey. As he wraps up that missionary enterprise, he is preparing to go back to Jerusalem. And then he wants to go to Spain. But on his way to Jerusalem, he's taking an offering. The churches he has founded, that he has started as a missionary, they have taken up an offering to help the Christians in Jerusalem who are economically deprived and are suffering. They're under financial hardship. And so these churches of Paul are sending a relief offering. And each of those churches have a representative who is going with Paul to Jerusalem at the end of Acts to take that relief offering. When the names of those traveling with Paul are mentioned, Tychichus is mentioned. So it's from one of the churches that Paul had founded on one of his missionary journeys. We're also told that he is from the province of Asia Minor. That is what is today Western Turkey. Now, what's interesting is that Ephesus is in Asia Minor. So Tychichus is from that area. He had been traveling with Paul back to Jerusalem. Now, remember, Paul, of course, was arrested there and then eventually sent to Rome to stand trial before Caesar. It seems that Tychichus stayed with Paul all this time to help him and had traveled as a friend with Paul back to Rome and is even now been ministering to Paul while he is under house arrest in Rome at the end of the book of Acts. But at this point, Paul sends him back to Asia Minor, back toward his home area, carrying this letter. So he is carrying the letter to the Ephesians, and he is going to tell them how Paul is faring, how things are going with the trial, and exactly what Paul is doing while he's under house arrest. So Tychichus is mentioned in Acts, and now he's mentioned here in Ephesians carrying this letter. Tychichus is also mentioned in the letter of Colossians. He also is carrying that letter. Now, we know that Ephesians and Colossians, those two letters, were written at the same time while Paul was in prison in Rome. And so Tychichus is carrying these letters at the same time. So when he travels forward, he's carrying the letter to the Ephesians, he's carrying the letter to the Colossians. Colossae is not far from Ephesus. And so Tychichus carries both these letters. And so he's mentioned in Ephesians and in Colossians. He's mentioned two other times in the New Testament, both in letters of Paul. He's mentioned in the letter Paul wrote to Titus, which comes after this, and he's also mentioned in the letter Paul wrote to Timothy, the second letter, 2 Timothy. that was the last letter that Paul wrote that we have preserved for us, 2 Timothy. So we know from all of this that Tychichus was a convert of Paul's. He was a member of one of his churches he founded, and he became a helper to Paul, a fellow minister. He is called a brother, a faithful servant in the Lord, and a minister. So he was a great help to Paul. The fact that he's mentioned these times shows that he was always with Paul, helping him in his ministry. That shows the importance of Christian friendship, how we stand with one another and we help each other in our ministries. None of us serves the Lord alone, but we are linked with other believers who are our brothers and sisters in Christ, our fellow servants of the Lord, and we aid and help and just kind of enable each other to carry on whatever ministry and service the Lord has given us. So Tychichus was such a friend and such a helper to the Apostle Paul. And though he's mentioned only a few times, we know what a great man he must have been and what a tremendous help he was to the Apostle Paul in the ministry of the early church. Hope you join us tomorrow. Tomorrow we're gonna in our session tomorrow we'll wrap up our study of the book of Ephesians. So join us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of Ephesians.